The map of the Pacific Ocean was supposed to be Japan's greatest weapon. In the early days of the war, the Imperial High Command looked at the vast blue expanse stretching between their home islands and the United States and felt a profound sense of security. They believed in the tyranny of distance. To strike Tokyo, an enemy would need bases close enough to launch aircraft, and in 1941 and 1942, Japan had systematically pushed those bases out of reach. They had built a defensive perimeter that stretched thousands of miles, a ring of steel meant to keep the American bombers at bay. The Japanese commanders, steeped in the traditions of naval warfare and decisive battles, expected that any assault on the homeland would come from an invasion fleet, not from the sky, or at least not in a way that could threaten the very existence of the state. They prepared for battleships and amphibious landings. They did not prepare for the industrial annihilation that would rain down from the stratosphere. This confidence was rattled, briefly, by the Doolittle raid in April 1942, but that was dismissed as a stunt, a psychological trick that caused negligible physical damage. It was seen as a desperate gasp from a dying enemy. What the Japanese leadership failed to grasp was that American industry was not just building weapons, it was solving the physics of distance. While Japanese strategists were moving pins on a map, American engineers at Boeing were designing a machine that would render those maps obsolete. This was the B-29 Superfortress, a weapon that cost more to develop than the atomic bomb. It was a technological leap so profound that Japanese intelligence simply couldn't comprehend its capabilities until it was physically flying over their heads. They had no concept of a pressurized bomber that could fly at 30,000 feet, faster than most of their fighters, carrying a payload that could level a city block. The turning point, the moment the illusion of safety truly shattered, was the fall of the Mariana Islands in the summer of 1944. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. To the Japanese public, these were just distant names in the news. To the American Air Forces, they were unsinkable aircraft carriers parked just within striking range of Tokyo. The moment the Marines secured those islands, the fate of the Japanese cities was sealed, though the commanders in Tokyo refused to see it. They still believed that their anti-aircraft defenses, their fighter squadrons, and the sheer logistical difficulty of maintaining a bomber fleet so far from home would save them. They were wrong. They underestimated the sheer brute force of American engineering. Naval construction battalions transformed the coral jungles of the Marianas into the busiest airports in the world, with runways stretching for miles, designed specifically to launch the heavy B-29s. However, the beginning of the campaign was not the apocalypse the Americans had promised. It was a struggle. The early high-altitude precision bombing raids were failures, and this gave the Japanese High Command a false sense of renewed hope. They watched as American bombs drifted miles off target, carried away by the ferocious jet stream winds that roared over Japan at high altitudes, a weather phenomenon the Americans hadn't known existed. The Japanese commanders laughed. They saw the B-29s struggling with engine fires and mechanical failures. They convinced themselves that the spirit of Japan was repelling the invaders, that the technology of the West was flawed and fragile. They believed that if they could just hold on, the Americans would tire of the cost. They did not understand that the failure of tactics would not stop the war. It would only force the Americans to change the rules of the game. That change came in the form of General Curtis LeMay. He arrived in the Marianas with a mandate to produce results, and he brought with him a cold, mathematical ruthlessness that the Japanese samurai spirit was entirely unprepared for. LeMay looked at the problem of the jet stream and the cloud cover, and he made a decision that would change the history of warfare. He realized that the Japanese war industry wasn't concentrated in massive singular factories like in Germany. It was dispersed. A drill press in a living room, a lathe in a kitchen, small feeder workshops hidden within the dense wooden residential districts of Tokyo. To destroy the industry, he reasoned, he had to destroy the neighborhoods. And to destroy the neighborhoods, he didn't need high explosives, he needed fire. The Japanese cities were built of wood and paper. They were organic, breathing things that had burned before in earthquakes and accidents. But Japanese civil defense planning was woefully inadequate for what was coming. They expected sporadic raids. They expected to fight fires with bucket lines and hand pumps. They did not expect a coordinated, scientifically designed arson on a continental scale. LeMay ordered his bombers to strip out their defensive guns to save weight. He ordered them to fly low, dangerously low, at 5,000 feet to bypass the jet stream. And he loaded them not with explosive bombs, but with the M69 incendiary, a cluster of naphthol-filled tubes designed to scatter, ignite, and burn at temperatures that could melt steel. On the night of March 9, 1945, the illusion of the protected homeland was incinerated. Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo, was not a battle, it was a massacre of logistics. The first Pathfinders dropped their loads, marking a fiery X in the darkness of the city. Then the main force arrived. Hundreds of B-29s flying single file poured out their cargo. The Japanese commanders on the ground were paralyzed. Their night fighters were blind, their anti-aircraft guns couldn't track the low-flying shadows fast enough, and the wind that had once saved them from the Mongol fleets, now betrayed them. It fanned the flames into a firestorm, a superheated hurricane that sucked the oxygen out of the air. The reports that reached the emperor and the high command the next morning were incomprehensible. They spoke of rivers boiling. They spoke of glass liquefying in window frames. They spoke of 100,000 dead in a single night, more than the immediate toll of the atomic bombs that would come later. The strategic bombing campaign had shifted from a military operation to a force of nature. The Japanese leadership had expected a war of soldiers. They got a war of physics. They had assumed that as long as their army was intact, the nation stood, but LeMay proved that a nation could be killed without its army ever being defeated in the field. After Tokyo, the campaign became methodical. It wasn't just anger, it was a checklist. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama. One by one, the industrial centers were erased. The Americans ran the bombing raids like a business. They analyzed the burn percentages. They printed leaflets listing the next cities to be hit, dropping them on the population beforehand, a psychological weapon that terrified the civilians and humiliated the military government, which was powerless to stop the attacks. The Japanese commanders could only watch as the sky turned black with planes that they had no fuel to intercept. The blockade by U.S. submarines had cut off the oil, and now the bombers were burning the reserves. The psychological impact on the Japanese leadership was shattering. Men who had sworn to die for the emperor, who had preached the doctrine of the decisive battle, found themselves staring at maps where entire cities had simply ceased to exist as productive entities. The coordination was the key. It wasn't just one raid, it was the relentless, rhythmic pounding. The Americans could strike anywhere, at any time, in any weather, thanks to radar and the sheer quantity of aircraft. The Japanese realized too late that they weren't fighting a military force, they were fighting an industrial assembly line that stretched from the factories of Detroit to the runways of Tinian, ending in the skies over Japan. The terrifying aspect for the Japanese generals was the realization of their own impotence. In the past, they could blame a loss on bad weather, or poor intelligence, or a lack of spirit. But here, the math was undeniable. If you have wooden cities and the enemy has napalm, and you cannot shoot down the delivery system, the equation only ends one way. They had built their entire war strategy on the idea that the American public was soft, that they wouldn't have the stomach for a long, brutal war. They never imagined that the Americans would detach themselves from the brutality, putting it into the hands of young men in pressurized cabins 30,000 feet in the air, or 5,000 feet in the dark, pressing buttons that turned square miles of civilization into ash. By June 1945, the B-29s were running out of targets. They began hitting secondary cities, tertiary towns. The Japanese economy had collapsed. Trains stopped running because the tracks were warped by heat. Workers stopped going to factories because the factories were gone, or because they were too busy trying to find food and shelter in the ruins. The coordinated strategic bombing had achieved something that naval blockades and island hopping alone could not. It severed the bond between the government and the people. The government promised protection. The sky proved they were lying.
The final irony for the Japanese High Command was that they had spent decades preparing for the decisive battle between battleships, a clash of titans at sea. They got their wish, in a way, but the battleship was a 4-engine plane and the ocean was the sky. When the final atomic bombs finally fell in August, they were merely the punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very burning sentence. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was shocking, but in terms of square mileage and displaced lives, it was a continuation of the policy LeMay had started in March. The conventional firebombing had already done the work of breaking the nation's spine. In the end, the silence returned to the skies over Japan, but it was the silence of a graveyard. The Japanese commanders, those who survived, had to reconcile their pre-war arrogance with the post-war ruin. They had underestimated not just the enemy's capability, but the enemy's intent. They never expected coordinated strategic bombing because they couldn't conceive of a war where the front line was everywhere, where the distinction between combatant and civilian was erased by fire, and where the distance they counted on for safety was erased by the terrible ingenuity of the B-29. The war was lost not on the beaches of invasion, but in the charred remains of the cities they swore to protect.